You know, whenever we talk about medicines or chemicals that changed modern science, we usually imagine something created by accident, discovered in a basement lab or stumbled upon in the middle of a crisis. But ketamine's story starts quietly, almost gently, not in a war zone, not in an emergency room, but in a simple Midwestern laboratory on an ordinary day in 1962. Picture this: a young chemist walks into a research building carrying a stack of old papers, reports about an older drug called PCP. At the time, PCP wasn't famous. It was actually a problem. Doctors wanted something like it, but without the side effects that turned people violent or disconnected from reality. So the question in the lab was simple: can we make something safer? Nobody in that room knew that the answer would become one of the most versatile medical tools of the next century. The chemist mixed, tested, and refined molecule after molecule. Dozens of failures, hundreds of adjustments. But science works like that. Tiny changes, tiny corrections, and then suddenly a good idea appears. And that idea was ketamine. On paper, it didn't look special. Just another compound in a long list of experimental anesthetics. But the first time it was tested on animals, the researchers froze. They saw something they had never seen before. The animals didn't struggle. They didn't panic. They didn't disappear like with PCP. They simply went still, calm, protected, breathing normally. An anesthetic that didn't stop breathing? That alone was a miracle. The team sat around the table late that evening, passing the lab notes back and forth, quietly realizing they had created something different. A drug that shuts down pain without shutting down life. In that moment, they didn't know ketamine would travel to war zones. They didn't know it would save soldiers. They didn't know it would later become a tool in psychiatry or be discussed by neuroscientists, paramedics, therapists, astronauts, or emergency physicians. All they knew was this: a new door had opened. A tiny molecule, barely understood, was about to step out of the lab and into history. Imagine a quiet hospital corridor in the mid-1960s. No fancy machines, no digital monitors blinking on the wall. Just a soft echo of shoes on the floor, the smell of alcohol wipes, and a room full of researchers wrestling with a decision. They had tested ketamine on animals. They had seen its unusual calmness, the way it protected vital functions. But now came the moment no scientist can completely prepare for, the first human trial. And believe me, nobody is relaxed during a first-in-human test. Not the researchers, not the volunteers, not even the hallway feels relaxed. Inside the room, a volunteer sits on a metal-framed bed, legs dangling off the edge, fingers tapping, pretending not to be nervous. The physician leans forward with a clipboard, explaining what will happen. You may feel disconnected. Things may sound distant. You might feel like you're floating. But ketamine was new. Nobody really knew how the mind would respond. The syringe fills slowly, clear, quiet, almost harmless looking. When the needle goes in, the researchers watch every breath, every blink, every tiny shift in the volunteer's face. And then, something unexpected happens. The volunteer doesn't panic, doesn't scream, doesn't lose control. Instead, he blinks twice, looks around the room, and says something the research team will never forget. I feel separated. But I'm still here, separated, but still here. That sentence would follow ketamine for decades. For the rest of the trial, the volunteer lies back calmly, speaking slowly, like he's underwater, but still conscious. He describes colors that aren't in the room, sounds that aren't being made, memories mixing with dreamlike images. The researchers write everything down, not because the phenomenon is scary, but because it's new. An anesthetic that allows the body to sleep while the mind drifts elsewhere. This wasn't normal, this wasn't expected. But it was fascinating. And perhaps most shocking of all, the volunteer wakes up normally. No confusion, no aggression, no violent after effects like PCP. Just a slow stretch, a deep breath, and a simple, "Did it work?" The room relaxes for the first time in 30 minutes. But here's the twist. While the trial looked like a success, the doctors noticed something subtle, something that didn't fit into any textbook. Even after waking up, the volunteers reported a sense of emotional clarity. No pain, no anxiety, no lingering fear. It wasn't sedation. It wasn't euphoria either. It was something strange, a kind of peaceful detachment. And that was when one physician whispered a prediction. This drug is going to go far beyond anesthesia. At that moment, they couldn't begin to imagine how true that would be, that decades later, ketamine would be used not only for surgery, but for depression, PTSD, chronic pain, and fields that didn't even exist yet. But before ketamine could step into hospitals around the world, before it could help children, burn victims, accident patients, or soldiers, it had to pass through its toughest test, the battlefield, a place where medicine doesn't get time to think. It only gets time to work. There are places in history where science is tested, not in laboratories, but in chaos. And the Vietnam War was one of those places. A world of heat, mud, helicopters slicing through humid air, and young soldiers who were barely old enough to shave. Every second mattered. Every scream mattered. Every drop of time could mean life or death. Into this storm, ketamine arrived quietly, in metal medical kits carried by exhausted medics who had no idea how important this little vial would become. The first field test. Picture a jungle clearing after an ambush. Gunfire has stopped, but the echo still hangs in the trees. A medic slides on his knees through wet leaves toward a soldier who's been hit, chest rising fast, pain swallowing him whole. The medic has seconds, not minutes. Not time for a stretcher team. Not time for delicate calculations. Under the roar of helicopter blades approaching, he pulls out a vial labeled with a name he barely recognizes. Ketamine. No heart monitor. No oxygen machine. No fancy equipment, just instinct. He pushes the needle in. For a moment, the soldier's breathing slows. His eyes lose the sharpness of pain. His body relaxes, but not dangerously, just enough to pull him away from the shock. When the helicopter finally lifts off, the medic sits back for the first time that day, staring at the vial in his hand. Something about ketamine felt different. It didn't stop the soldier's breathing. It didn't cause panic or aggression. It simply created a doorway that the soldier could step through. A doorway away from agony. Word spread fast. A drug built for chaos doctors at base camps started noticing the same things. Breathing stayed stable. Blood pressure held. Patients stayed calm even with severe injuries. Trauma didn't overwhelm them. They woke up without confusion or violence. These weren't small advantages. These were battlefield miracles. Other anesthetics needed oxygen. They needed monitoring. They needed quiet rooms and metal equipment. Ketamine needed none of that. All it needed was a medic with two hands and a decision to save someone. The Huey helicopter stories. There were hundreds of rescue flights across Vietnam, but one story is told again and again by veterans. A helicopter picks up 3 wounded soldiers, all in terrible condition. The flight medic looks at them and whispers to himself, "Without something fast, none of them will make it." He has only 1 vial left. 1. He divides the dose carefully between the 3, and something astonishing happens. The moaning stops, the panic quiets, breathing steadies. The cabin becomes still, not because the situation is safe, but because ketamine pulls the men away from the edge just long enough to get them home. All 3 survive. Years later, when the medic tells the story, his voice cracks. "I think ketamine saved more guys than I ever did." How soldiers remembered it. If you talk to Vietnam veterans, many describe ketamine without even using the name. They call it things like the one that made it bearable, the thing that dulled the world, the medicine that saved my buddy, or simply the miracle shot. Because out there, far from hospitals, ketamine didn't feel like science. It felt like mercy. What military doctors saw. Back in the field hospitals, surgeons noticed another unexpected effect. Soldiers who received ketamine often woke up with less emotional distress, less fear, less panic, more clarity than expected. No one had the language for it then. No one knew it would one day be used for depression and PTSD, but the seeds were already there, silently planted in the minds of doctors who couldn't ignore what they were seeing. One surgeon wrote, "Ketamine keeps men alive long enough for us to save them. No other drug behaves like this." Another wrote, "It does not erase pain. It moves the patient away from it." That line became famous in military medical training. The drug that became a legend. By the end of the war, ketamine had proven itself in the harshest environment imaginable. Not in clean operating rooms, not with controlled lighting and soft beeping monitors, but in monsoon rain helicopters, muddy riverbanks, bomb craters, dark nights with no electricity, small huts turned into emergency rooms. It worked everywhere. No excuses, no fragile rules. And because of Vietnam, the world finally understood something. Ketamine wasn't just an anesthetic. It was a battlefield lifeline, a drug that didn't wait for perfect conditions. It created them. There are moments in medicine when a drug does exactly what you expect, and moments when it does something you cannot explain. Ketamine lived in the second category from the very beginning. Doctors understood anesthetics, at least the old ones. Ether, chloroform, barbiturates. They pushed the brain down, 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 like turning off switches in a dark room. One by one, the lights faded until consciousness disappeared. But ketamine didn't behave like that. It didn't shut the lights off. It simply picked the patient up and moved them somewhere else. The first human trials, a strange new silence, in the mid-1960s, the first volunteers lay on tables in quiet hospital rooms, breathing normally, heart beating steady, while their minds drifted to landscapes that had no medical explanation. Patients described floating tunnels, colors, weightlessness, the sense of being in 2 places at once, hearing sounds from far away, like memories underwater. One medical student in an early trial said, "My body was here, but I was somewhere behind a glass wall." The researchers watched with clipboards, confused but fascinated. No anesthetic had ever done this. The term dissociative anesthesia was born because no other phrase fit, and even that felt like a small label on something enormous. What was actually happening? Ketamine wasn't turning the brain off. It was disconnecting the brain's central hub, the system that ties sensations, memory, pain, and identity into a single experience. Imagine the mind as a city. Normal anesthetics shut the power grid down. Ketamine? It leaves the power on, but cuts the roads between neighborhoods. Everything still works, but nothing talks to anything else. This disconnect produces a strange paradox. The patient can hear a voice, but it doesn't feel like it's happening to them. Pain exists, but it doesn't reach them. They feel present, but not attached to the moment. This was shocking. Not terrifying, just unfamiliar. Doctors realized ketamine created a kind of mental safe room, a small chamber where the patient could hide from the world. In surgery, this was a blessing. In psychiatry, it would one day become a revolution. But back then, in the 60s, nobody understood it yet. Patients' descriptions became a mystery archive. Over the next decade, hundreds of reports came from patients describing states that sounded more like poetry than pharmacology. A woman undergoing a minor procedure said, "I felt like I stepped out of my body and sat beside myself." A man said, "It was like someone turned down the volume of reality." A child said, "I became a balloon and floated above the bed." The dissociation wasn't terrifying. It was surreal, quiet, sometimes even comforting. Doctors noted something else. Patients often woke up calmer than expected, sometimes even emotionally lighter. Nobody could explain why. They simply wrote in journals, "Mood improved post-op. Unexpected relief from anxiety. Patient more relaxed than baseline." The clues were there, but the puzzle pieces didn't fit yet. The dark side doctors feared. Of course, not every experience was peaceful. Some patients reported strange shapes, distorted voices, the sense of floating away too far, fragmented memories, dream-like hallucinations. Not violent, not dangerous, just unfamiliar. Surgeons called them emergency reactions. Hospitals dimmed the lights to reduce them. Nurses spoke softly. The environment became part of the treatment, and slowly, ketamine earned respect. Not fear, not superstition, respect. Because even when the visions were intense, ketamine still preserved. Breathing, heart function, reflexes, stability. It was a mind trip inside a safety net. No other anesthetic offered that. The psychiatric world begins to notice. By the late 1970s, psychiatrists were quietly talking about ketamine's strange side effects. They weren't allowed to prescribe it for mood, not yet, but they couldn't ignore the patterns. So they began small, unofficial observations. Depressed patients waking up with unexpected clarity, anxious patients feeling relief for hours, trauma patients recalling their experience with less fear. The early notes sound almost confused. One psychiatrist wrote, "Patients report a reduction in existential distress after ketamine." Another wrote, "There appears to be a separation between the self and emotional suffering," but no one knew what to do with that information. Ketamine was still seen as a surgical drug, a battlefield tool. Nobody imagined it would one day help millions battling depression. Nobody imagined it would be compared to EEK. Nobody imagined it would become one of the fastest-acting antidepressants in history. The medical world had discovered the effect, but they didn't yet understand the meaning. a drug that revealed the mind's hidden pathways. Today, neuroscientists explain ketamine in elegant diagrams and charts. Back then, the only evidence came from human stories, raw, unfiltered, honest. Stories like, "It felt like I stepped away from my sadness for the first time in years. Like I saw my life from above and understood it differently. For a moment, I wasn't trapped in my own thoughts." These weren't mere side effects. They were early whispers of the future, a future where ketamine would help rewrite the mind's narrative. But in the 1970s, doctors only knew one thing for certain. Ketamine touched consciousness itself, not to destroy it, but to rearrange it, and no other anesthetic had ever done that. When ketamine first entered the world, it was a medical instrument, cold, clean, precise, a glass vial on a metal tray in a hospital. But no drug with such unusual effects stays in one corner forever. History is full of chemicals that began as tools and became stories. Caffeine, opium, cocaine, LSD. Ketamine would join that lineage, but it would take a very particular path to get there. The transition nobody saw coming. By the late 1970s, ketamine was a trusted anesthetic. Surgeons loved it. Paramedics relied on it. Veterinarians used it safely every day. But outside the hospital walls, whispers were spreading. The dissociation, that floating, detached, dreamlike state, fascinated more than just researchers. Somewhere in a basement club in the early 1980s, a young man, half drunk and curious, took a small amount of ketamine someone had stolen from a veterinary clinic. And he didn't collapse. He didn't panic. He didn't become violent. He drifted, softly, quietly, surrounded by synthetic music and dim lights. His mind stepped sideways into a world he had never felt before. He told his friends told others, and a cultural shift began. The club scene of the 80s and 90s, ketamine slipped into nightlife slowly. At first it was something only insiders knew: warehouse parties, underground raves, late-night gatherings in abandoned industrial buildings. Music pulsed through giant speakers, smoke machines hissed, neon lights formed halos in the air. In that sensory overload, ketamine didn't feel like a drug. It felt like a doorway. People described experiences like, "I felt like I was dancing outside my own body. The whole room became weightless. The music was inside me instead of around me." The club environment amplified the dissociative effects, but also distorted them. And soon, a myth formed: the Kai-hole, a state where someone takes too much and their consciousness sinks deep into dissociation. Not dangerous, not deadly, but intensely disorienting. Clubs whispered about it like an urban legend. Don't fall into the hole. Keep your dose small. Watch your friend. Some people feared it. Others chased it. But the word spread everywhere. The media panic begins. By the early 1990s, mainstream media discovered ketamine not as a life-saving anesthetic, not as a psychiatric tool, but as a club drug. Newspapers ran headlines like "Vet Drug Invades Nightlife," "Teenagers Abusing Animal Anesthetic," "Dangerous Disassociation Poisoning Youth." None of these stories mentioned its safety profile, its battlefield use, its medical importance, its enormous potential. The media didn't want nuance. They wanted alarm. And so, ketamine, the calm, reliable anesthetic, became a villain in the public eye. Doctors were frustrated. Researchers were angry. Surgeons rolled their eyes. One anesthesiologist famously said on TV, Ketamine is one of the safest drugs we have. The problem is not the molecule. The problem is the stories people tell about it. But once a drug enters pop culture, you cannot pull it back. The myth grows larger than the molecule. The economist generations in the late 1990s and early 2000s, ketamine became part of the language of electronic dance music. EDM, trance, house, drum and bass. Some tracks were named after it. Some DJs talked about it openly. Some clubs adopted it as part of their identity. Ketamine became the quiet drug of the nightlife world, not for hype, not for chaos, but for drifting, floating, slow-motion introspection. People said it. Made music feel three-dimensional, turned lights into soft waves, slowed time, made the body dissolve into rhythm. This was not what chemists in the 1960s imagined. This was not what battlefield medics saw. But culture always finds a way to repurpose tools for its own rituals. The problem: a drug without context in hospitals, ketamine is guided by experts. Outside, it becomes unpredictable. The nightclub use introduced risks. Unmeasured doses mixing with alcohol, poor setting confusion, rare cases of unsafe behavior. People using it without understanding the effects. These risks, fueled by sensational media coverage, buried ketamine's true identity. The world saw ketamine as a party drug, not a medical miracle. And that misunderstanding delayed its acceptance in psychiatry for decades. Scientists kept pushing back through the 1990s. Small groups of researchers published papers saying, "There's something here we're ignoring." They argued that the dissociation was meaningful, the antidepressant effect was real, ketamine had untapped potential. But funding was impossible to get. No agency wanted to support a drug associated with club scenes. And so ketamine existed between two worlds, beloved in medicine, feared in culture, misunderstood in society. The disconnect widens. Imagine a trauma surgeon in 1999 finishing a long shift, saving 3 patients with ketamine, then turning on the news and hearing it described as a dangerous street chemical. Imagine a psychiatrist reading about a club overdose while quietly thinking, "This drug could help my treatment-resistant patients." Imagine a researcher watching their grant proposal rejected because ketamine had become a cultural myth instead of a scientific tool. This was the period when ketamine lived 2 separate lives, one scientific, one cultural, barely intersecting. The stage was set for a return, and yet science doesn't forget. Data doesn't disappear. Behind the noise of club scenes and media panic, a handful of pioneers kept studying ketamine's effects on depression, trauma, PTSD, existential distress. Their papers were small, their voices quiet, but they said the same thing again and again. Ketamine does something to the mind no other drug does. We should pay attention. They were ignored, for now, but the seeds were planted. And soon, ketamine's story would leave the nightclubs, return to medicine, and transform psychiatry forever. For decades, ketamine lived in a strange shadow. Doctors trusted it. Scientists admired it. Nightclubs misused it. And society misunderstood it. But somewhere underneath all that noise, ketamine was quietly waiting to show the world its most extraordinary ability, not to dull pain, not to help in war, not to make surgery safer, but something far more profound, to break the chains of depression. The limits of old antidepressants. To understand ketamine's revolution, you have to picture the world before it arrived. For most of the late 20th century, antidepressants followed a single model: change serotonin. SSR is SNR is tricyclics, all variations of the same strategy, and they helped millions, yes. But anyone who worked in psychiatry knew the limits. They took weeks to work. Some people gained weight. Some lost energy. Some felt emotionally flat. Many patients didn't respond at all. And in crisis, wait 4 weeks was not a helpful sentence. The psychiatric world was quietly frustrated. Patients who were suicidal didn't have weeks. Sometimes they barely had hours. Doctors needed something faster, something that could reach the deepest part of despair, the part where serotonin barely mattered. The search dragged on for years, and then a group of researchers did something curious. They looked back at ketamine, the same old drug nobody wanted to talk about. The 2000 study that changed everything in the year 2000, a team at Yale, led by Robert Berman, published a small, modest paper. One of those studies that doesn't make the news but changes the future. They gave low-dose ketamine to patients with severe treatment-resistant depression. Not enough to cause hallucinations. Not enough for anesthesia. Just a fraction of a medical dose. And something happened that psychiatry had never seen before. Within hours, not weeks, not days, but hours, the patients began to feel better. One participant described it like this: "It felt like someone turned a light on in my mind." Another said, "I didn't know relief could come that fast." The researchers stared at the results in disbelief. Depression dropping within 2 to 4 hours, suicidal thoughts reducing before dinner. Mood lifting the same day. This wasn't supposed to be possible. It overturned decades of psychiatric understanding. Ketamine had just rewritten the rules. A new understanding of mental illness. For the first time, scientists realized depression might not only be about chemical imbalances. Ketamine revealed something deeper. Depression is a disorder of neural connections. In depressed brains, synapses weaken, connections shrink, pathways go quiet, circuits collapse from chronic stress. Ketamine did something miraculous. It didn't just affect neurotransmitters. It rebuilt connections, like rain falling on a dried forest, like electricity returning to a darkened neighborhood, like a mind receiving oxygen after years of suffocation. Ketamine caused rapid synaptogenesis, the growth of brand new neural pathways, within hours. Nothing in psychiatry had ever worked like this. The first patient stories by the late 2000s, ketamine clinics began opening quietly across the US, Canada, and Europe. Mostly small rooms, 2 chairs, soft lamps. Nurses who had seen too much sadness in their careers. And then the stories started. A woman who hadn't laughed in months said, "I felt myself come back." A man who lived with depression for 20 years whispered, "I don't want to die anymore. Not tonight." A veteran with PTSD said, "It's like the war in my head finally stopped shouting." And these stories weren't rare. They were happening day after day, hour after hour across the world. The psychiatric community suddenly found itself facing a strange truth. Ketamine wasn't just effective, it was transformative. The dissociation became part of the healing, the dissociation that once confused doctors. The same sensation that turned ketamine into folklore now became a therapeutic tool. Patients often described it like this: "For the first time, I watched my depression from the outside. I saw my pain but didn't feel trapped inside it. I felt distance, from the voice that tells me I'm worthless. Ketamine didn't erase trauma, it loosened its grip. It gave people room to breathe around their suffering. Therapists noticed something remarkable. Ketamine created a psychological window, a space where patients could rethink, reframe, reimagine their lives. This wasn't escapism. This wasn't numbing. This wasn't recreation. This was insight, sometimes painful, often necessary, liberating in ways traditional medicine never achieved. The approval that took too long by the 2010s, thousands of studies confirmed it. Ketamine was the most promising antidepressant in a generation, but stigma was still strong. The clubbed drug label haunted its reputation. Many hospitals refused to touch it. Insurance companies looked the other way. Finally, in 2019, nearly 60 years after its invention, a formulation of ketamine, esketamine, was approved for treatment-resistant depression. It was a historic moment, not because the FDA changed its rules, but because psychiatry had just admitted that the old model wasn't enough. The beginning of a new era today, ketamine therapy is used to treat major depression, treatment-resistant depression, suicidal crisis, PTSD, anxiety disorders, chronic pain, existential distress in the terminally ill, and beyond clinical success. Ketamine helped rewrite our understanding of mental illness. It showed that brains can heal faster than we thought, consciousness is more flexible than we imagined. Depression is not permanent, despair is not destiny, connection can regrow, hope can return, and sometimes all it takes is one session, one infusion, one moment of clarity, one breath of relief, a drug that became a lifeline. People often think medical revolutions come from new drugs, but ketamine reminds us sometimes the miracle was sitting on the shelf all along, we just didn't know how to look at it. From a battlefield anesthetic, to a misunderstood club chemical, to the fastest-acting antidepressant in modern medicine, ketamine's journey is not just scientific, it is human. It is the story of suffering, discovery, stigma, and redemption. A reminder that healing can come from unexpected places, and its evolution isn't over yet. If Part 6 was about ketamine's breakthrough in depression, Part 7 is about its tomorrow, the promise, the controversy, and the questions no one has easy answers for. The dawn of psychedelic medicine. By the 2020s, ketamine had opened a door. Researchers started asking bigger questions. What else can dissociative, psychedelic-like compounds do for the mind? How can therapy combine with these experiences? Can trauma, anxiety, and existential despair be treated in ways no pill ever allowed? Ketamine was no longer just a drug. It had become a tool to explore consciousness, a bridge between chemistry and mind, a key to the spaces inside us we often cannot reach alone. Scientists, therapists, and patients were all learning together. Therapy meets chemistry. Ketamine therapy today is rarely just about the infusion. It is guided, structured, intentional. A trained therapist often sits with the patient. Soft lights, calm music, mindful preparation. The session may feel strange, dissociative. Thoughts may drift, emotions may flare, memories may surface, but the goal is integration, to take the fleeting insights from that altered state and translate them into lasting change in everyday life. Some patients describe it as meeting my own mind without judgment, seeing my fear as separate from myself, feeling a moment of freedom I didn't think was possible. And this is what sets ketamine apart from traditional medications. It is not just chemistry. It is chemistry plus human reflection. Controversy and caution. Of course, ketamine is not a miracle for everyone, and its rise has brought controversy. Some concerns include long-term effects are still under study, dependency or misuse potential exists. It can produce intense, confusing dissociation if not guided. Insurance and accessibility remain uneven. Misuse in non-clinical settings continues. Researchers stress context matters. Setting, guidance, and intention can be as critical as the dose itself. Ketamine reminds us that medicine is not just about molecules. It is about how humans meet them. Cultural reconciliation. Interestingly, ketamine has finally started to reclaim its narrative. The same society that feared it as a club drug is beginning to respect its therapeutic power. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and media stories are correcting the record. A battlefield anesthetic, a misunderstood recreational chemical, a psychiatric breakthrough. All three are true. All three exist simultaneously. And all three are part of ketamine's human story. It reminds us how society interprets tools. First fear, then fascination, then cautious respect. Looking forward, the future of ketamine is intertwined with the rise of psychedelic medicine in general. Clinical trials are expanding. PTSD in veterans, depression and suicidal crisis, addiction therapy, chronic pain, end-of-life anxiety. And as our understanding deepens, so does our respect for the molecule's subtlety. Ketamine teaches a lesson beyond psychiatry. Healing is rarely linear. It may arrive from unexpected places. It may be misunderstood at first. It may carry a shadow of its history, both cultural and chemical. Yet even so, the potential remains. A human reflection. What makes ketamine extraordinary is not its chemical formula. It's the human stories that surround it. Soldiers saved from battlefield pain. Patients lifted from the depths of despair. Scientists pushing against skepticism. Society slowly learning to look beyond myths. Ketamine's story reminds us that progress often comes layered, complicated, and misunderstood. A molecule invented in the urgency of war can become a lifeline decades later. A chemical first used to control pain can ultimately help people reclaim their minds. And in the quiet rooms where therapy and chemistry meet, the same molecule that once left patients floating in strange spaces now brings them back to themselves. More whole, more alive, more hopeful. Closing thought. So the journey of ketamine is complete in one sense. From battlefield tents to research labs to nightclubs to psychiatric clinics, its path reflects not just the evolution of medicine, but the evolution of human understanding itself. It is a story of discovery, of fear and fascination, of redemption and hope, and perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that sometimes the tools we need most are hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to understand them fully and use them wisely.